Today we'll continue to look at The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil. And today we'll focus on humour, irony and metaphor. One of the things that attracted me to The Man Without Qualities was its underlying humour, chiefly manifested in the very dry or ironic observations and asides, as well as its striking similes. This sort of humour isn't to everyone's liking, of course, but it's a facet of humour that tickles me, and it's the sort of humour that people recognise as my forte. Musil isn't a humorist nor a satirist. Perhaps we could describe him as an essayist, but I'm sure he'd be more than happy if we just called him a great writer. His humour is a tool for exposition and revelation, useful in showing forth the faults and foibles of men, the view ultimately to their redemption. I'd like to read from an essay by Todd Cesarato, available in this volume, Musiliana. The essay is entitled Humour, Musil plus the Romantics, and he describes Musil's motive in using humour. Musil's drive is to bring intellectual, often hypocritical inconsistencies to light. To do so, he uses not wrath, but propositional description mixed with humour. So let's take a look at some of examples in the novel. In chapter 7, we see the main protagonist, Ulrich, is met with a young lady called Bonadea. They start going out, and Musil dryly observes, 2 weeks later, Bonadea had been his mistress for 14 days. Such a dry humour, I found that funny. Probably not everyone does. In chapter 72, Musil describes the men of Austria and how they grew beards so they'd have something to smile into. In chapter 80, General Sturm von Budria, an elderly man in the army, says that he's not balding, he's merely decided that he should grow his forehead. This same character, a few chapters later, says you shouldn't take things in the army too seriously. If you do, you may as well go home riding bareback on a hedgehog. Musil also talks about writers. He says even the youngest trainee in a firm of world rank has the whole world circling round him, while the lone writer in his seclusion has at most flies circling around him. In chapter 95, still on writers, he says that established writers look down on newer writers as being folk of unobtrusive talents made up of 49% ability and 51% inability. All very funny observations that show us that the author is a keen contemplator of humanity. So let's look at irony in The Man Without Qualities. Musil uses irony throughout the novel, and this use of irony is very effectual in a considered and deliberate way. From his diaries, let me read this little passage. Musil says that in the course of the 10 or so manuscripts for what are only 200 pages of the first part of The Man Without Qualities, I reached the significant insight that the most appropriate style of writing for me is that of irony. Musil sought to use irony constructively, to highlight the failings and fallings of men. This use of irony may be somewhat hard to directly pinpoint in the novel, just as irony is hard to define on its own. And Alanis Morissette doesn't help in her song Ironic. In the song, she lists a number of examples of irony. However, on closer inspection, there aren't instances of irony at all, but merely instances of inconvenience or unexpected contretemps or coincidence. But then I thought, well, maybe that's the overarching idea of this song, a song about irony, where the examples of irony in the song aren't ironic. How ironic is that? The most ironic thing that's ever happened to me was that I hurt the tip of my finger once in one of those old metallic first aid boxes. That was pretty ironic, I thought. Let's look at The Man Without Qualities. Firstly, the great major underlying irony of particularly parts 1 and 2 concerns the parallel campaign. The parallel campaign was started by the Austrians in order to celebrate the 70th anniversary of their Emperor Franz Joseph. This Jubilee celebration was due in 1918. The Man Without Qualities is set in 1913, the year before the First World War. What the Austrians weren't to know in all their squabbles concerning the parallel campaign was that the Emperor Franz Joseph would die in 1916 anyway of pneumonia. An even greater irony, despite again all their struggles to find this great theme to celebrate the Jubilee, was that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would not exist in 1918. The First World War, which was due to start, would bring about the total collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire into smaller countries. The empire, ironically, would no longer exist. Also regarding the parallel campaign, because of all their arguments, they were desperate for a leader. And ironically, the most qualified leader, potential leader for the group, would be Ulrich. Ulrich was a man who had university training, was very intelligent, had experience in engineering, in the army, but yet he was not interested at all. He wanted to take a year off and consider life. He didn't want to get involved. He just wanted to watch the quibblings of man from a distance. So there's other examples of irony in The Man Without Qualities. Some may not, strictly speaking, be ironic. What I've written is this. Some may not, strictly speaking, be ironic. They may just be very wry or very acerbic humour at work. Sometimes they are a working sarcasm or an under or overstating of the obvious, with startling comparisons or juxtapositions. In chapter 13, there's a reference there to a racehorse of genius. This was made as a comment made from someone in the media. Ulrich looks at this and says, how can they not say that ironically? They can't take that seriously. Surely genius only applies to matters of the intellect. In fact, it's this comment that gets him on his journey of searching for meaning in the world. And he looks back on the time he spent in the army, where all they seemed to talk about was horses and women. It's as though he's thinking, one day we'll call women women of genius, just because they're very beautiful. In chapter 15, Musil writes about the Germans talking about the overman or the superhuman or the Übermensch, referencing the philosopher Nietzsche, and also this was a theme used by the Nazis in their uprising in the 30s. Musil asks, not without irony, where is consideration for the underman? In chapter 57, we see His Grace Count Leinsdorf expressing his desire for a spontaneous testimonial arising from the midst of the people. What he was to get 63 chapters later, ironically, was a mass riot of people protesting the parallel campaign, and they ended up surrounding his palace such that he couldn't even get out. One of the most interesting characters in The Man Without Qualities is Clarissa. And Musil says that her father was a well-known painter, but that ironically his masterpiece was his daughter. By the time we get to chapter 84, the parallel campaign is out of control, progressing to new levels of Kafkaesque intrigue. It even gets to a point where the committee have to announce a competition for the best plan for a competition regarding a monument. Even irony can't completely cover this level of absurdity. Let's now look at metaphor and simile. In my first video on The Man Without Qualities, I made mention of Hungarian author Miklos Szentkuthi. One of his publications is Towards the One and Only Metaphor. It's quite a difficult book to get your head around. One of the things he seems to be saying is that metaphors have had their day and are perhaps overrated. But this isn't the thinking with Robert Musil. Robert Musil proliferates in metaphor and simile throughout The Man Without Qualities. It's as if Musil is saying, how else could we know the way we think about our thought life if it was not for metaphors? In chapter 115, he has Ulrich thinking to himself, one human being, when you think of it, means nothing more to another one than a string of similes. And in chapter 37, for if a man wants to elevate himself above the daily rut, he resorts to figures of speech. An example of the proliferation of metaphor in The Man Without Qualities is in chapter 38, which is titled Clarisse and Her Demons. It's only 6.5 pages long, but in it I've counted 28 metaphors, 21 similes, and 1 analogy. The multitude of similes found in The Man Without Quality are humorous, beautiful, provocative, unusual, always striking and memorable. Let's look at some examples now. In chapter 28, Musil describes the Vienna weather as an asphalt spring, a seasonless spring day in autumn. In chapter 41, where young Rachel, looking back dismissively on her early life and family traditions, felt as little need for them, the traditions, as a flower needs a spoon and fork in order to nourish itself. In chapter 56, there's a description of a portrait of a lone woman, and it has her as wearing a wasp-waisted corset. In chapter 85, General Sturm, who we've already met, describes himself as being no more of a beauty than a peach with its skin off. In chapter 87, this quite unusual one, there's a character thinking that the sky looks like a Slovakian mousetrap, whatever a Slovakian mousetrap might be. In chapter 97, Clarissa smiled. It was her special smile, licking upward like a slender flame from a fire under a great stone. Very beautiful. In chapter 114, the description of a character's face is looking like a room with a bed still unmade at noon. And Ulrich, in chapter 3 of part 3, considers his recently deceased father who had formed the egg of his life from the shells of his forebears. In chapter 11 of part 3, Ulrich proclaims, "I'm studying the road to holiness to see if it might also be possible to drive a car on it." And in the very next chapter, we have this vague pronouncement from Ulrich. "As if my mouth was so far away from me as the moon, which is always on hand for confidential chats in the night." There's a lot more of wonderful similes throughout The Man Without Qualities. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope I've provoked you to want to explore this wonderful book. In my next video, my next planned video, I'll be talking about essayism and The Man Without Qualities.